Hi, I'm Jennifer Kirby, Managing Advocate from Compass Rose Disability Advocates. Welcome to the second video in our series designed to help people understand changes in our federal government and how they will affect people with disabilities. While researching to see if there have been any updates this week since last week's news about the closing of 7 regional civil rights offices belonging to the U.S. Department of Education, I came across an interesting quote. As we covered briefly last week, the new Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, has expressed her assurances that nothing about special education will change despite the eventual plans to close down the entire Department of Education. According to a great disability-focused publication, Disability Scoop, Ms. McMahon has since been asked if she knew exactly what IDEA entailed. She responded that since this was her 5th day on the job, we should note she was interviewed last week, she was not familiar with the specifics other than knowing that it did in fact impact people with disabilities. I'm sure she meant that to be heartening, but since disabilities is in the title of the law, I think we can agree that's somewhat of a minimum standard of knowledge. But in the charitable spirit of public service that goes along with this channel, I've decided that perhaps we could use this as an opportunity to educate Ms. McMahon on some of the background involving IDEA and the basic outlines of the law. Many of you watching this channel may be familiar with quite a bit of it because you have students with disabilities or you work with students with disabilities. But a basic refresher for everyone would probably be a good idea, as we are focusing on advocating to make sure that IDEA is in one way or another preserved. So with that, Ms. McMahon, in the words of one of my favorite fake newscasters, Jon Stewart, please join me at camera 1 so that I can explain the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act to you. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was passed in 1975, and then regulations for it were codified a few years later. It is designed to provide education for children with disabilities from birth to age 21. Some people might find it odd that it goes all the way down to birth, but that is because it is recognized, particularly for people with disabilities, that early intervention helps in many, many ways and can ideally help prevent the need for future services as the child grows. So, early intervention is governed under Part B of the law, and that serves children that are ages 0 through 0 up to their 3rd birthday. I'm sorry, I had a little pause there. It is designed primarily to provide therapeutic services because, of course, usually at the age of 0 to 2, you're not working on academics and pre-academic skills, and it's also designed to provide a lot of family support so that families can understand how to navigate life with a child with a disability and access the appropriate services. So that is Part C. Part B. Part C governs the education of people from age 3 to age 21 that are in the public school system. Age 3, of course, is the start of preschool, and the reason it goes up to age 21 is because there is a recognition that not everybody with a disability may be able to graduate at the standard age of 17, 18, or in some cases 19 is not an unusual age depending on when somebody's birthday is. all kids with disabilities on an IEP are entitled to receive special education services up till age 21 under federal law. Granted, not all children with disabilities take advantage of that, nor do many of them want to. It's generally a provision designed for kids with more significant cognitive issues. However, the law does not specifically state that. This is a good time to point out that one of the provisions of the federal law is that states can go over and above what federal law prescribes, but cannot go under it. As such, any state receiving funding under IDEA has to make a commitment to make special education available to students up until the age of 21. But some states, have chosen to go over and above that. For example, Ohio, the state in which I work, provides those services up until age 22, and Michigan, our neighboring state, provides those services up until age 26. So that's really a very clear-cut example of how the federal government can say, this is your minimum standard, but you as a state can vary from it as long as you're not providing less. And this is something to keep in mind as we discuss IDEA and all future topics, because one of the things you'll quite often hear in the media, particularly from folks who are advocating for getting rid of the Department of Education, is that it will be excellent to have all such services go back to state control. There's a lot to be said for state control in many ways, and there's a lot to be said for federal control. And I don't think people often realize that, particularly in the area of IDEA, even though there's an overarching federal law, states have a lot of leeway in how they implement this federal law. So that is why many of us as advocates are concerned and want to make sure there is still some level, an appropriate level of federal guidance and oversight. The services that are prescribed for kids under IDEA that are between the ages of 3 and up through 12th grade, whenever that may be for that particular child, encompass a number of areas. It's not just academic goals, but it can also provide therapy services. There are also provisions for how discipline is handled for people with disabilities, and there are also provisions for making sure that each and every student on an IEP is properly prepared whenever they leave school to either participate in supported or competitive employment or go on to further education, depending on their abilities and preferences. It is truly a law that's designed to make sure that people with disabilities have the most potential opportunity possible to become productive members of society and participate in their community. So first, we're going to start out with how academic goals would look. For students on an IEP, which is an individualized education plan, I should have said earlier, those students are the students whose disability is significant enough that they require a modification of curriculum or a different way of teaching particular parts of the curriculum than other typical students might require. This doesn't mean necessarily that it has to be across all subjects or in a segregated classroom or anything like that. In fact, IDEA makes it explicitly clear that the goal is that students on IEPs be educated with their typical peers in their home neighborhood as much as possible. So that is something to keep in mind. I, as an advocate, always say that least restrictive environment, which is the legislative term for this, a student's least restrictive environment is not necessarily one place all day. Depending on what the child is being asked to do during the day, they might have 3 or 4 different least restrictive environments depending on what they need to do. So it might be in a general education class, it might be in a therapy room, it might be in a resource room, it might be in any number of areas. So I always like to say we need to look at least restrictive environment hour by hour, not as a whole. This is where they are for the day. The way modified academic goals can look is that children with disabilities can be taught a different curriculum, or they can be taught the same curriculum but in a different way with it slowed down. And for example, they might not be required to know the same amount of material or write as complex an essay or that sort of thing. All of that goes under modifications, and that's what goes in the IEP goals for children that need academic goals. Another part of the IEP, though, is accommodations. And accommodations can be used by children on IEPs, and they can also be used by children on 504 plans. We'll cover 504 plans in a different video, but just as a basic frame of reference, because I probably get asked this 10 or 20 times a week, the difference between an IEP and a 504 plan is kiddos on IEPs require that specialized instruction and therapeutic services piece, whereas students on 504s can handle the regular curriculum in the regular classroom and may just need accommodations such as assistive technology to be able to access the material, extended time to be able to do the material, visual reminders, social cues, that sort of thing, but they're still able to do the curriculum. So from that description, you will see that there are many, many more students eligible for 504s than there would be for IEPs. And one of the big concerns that I alluded to previously that we all have is that the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights is the one that enforces whether or not 504 is followed and children are provided accommodations. They also oversee IDEA and provision of free appropriate public education. However, quite a bit of that investigation and oversight is left to the individual states. 504 oversight, however, is completely up to the federal government, and that's one of the reasons we're all concerned that so many offices have shut down now. But getting back to the components of an IEP. In addition to academic goals as appropriate, students might also have social and behavioral goals, and they might also have therapeutic goals. Therapeutic and sometimes social and behavioral goals are covered under something called related services quite often, where there are therapists or other providers that work in conjunction with the child's general education teacher and special education teacher, if applicable, to work on a particular set of skills. Related services can include speech therapy, and speech therapy not only covers articulation, which is how well you can pronounce words, but pragmatic language, which is how well you have a social understanding of language, and also language comprehension, which includes not only how well do you understand what is being spoken to you and what you're reading, but how well are you able to express yourself back to other people. So speech therapy has quite a number of components, and many children with many types of disabilities may have reason to be eligible for speech therapy. Physical therapy is another service that's provided that has probably the narrowest scope in terms of eligibility for direct services for children these days, and that is because the need for physical therapy is now defined as the need for support to be able to navigate the school environment and be able to function in the classroom, such as do you have the core strength to sit at a desk? If you're in a wheelchair like myself, do you need help transferring, things like that? And then are you able to navigate the building? As if you're in a wheelchair like me, can you use a wheelchair to get around? Are you able to access stairs safely if you're ambulatory? All that sort of thing. There's not a whole lot of clinical work with range of motion that goes on with physical therapy, which makes it significantly different than these many years ago when I was in school and received range of motion 3 times a week for half an hour a day. Other types of therapy that students can receive are occupational therapy, which mainly focuses on fine motor goals. That's the one that we often hear so much about. Like for younger kids, can they use scissors and can they hold a pen or a crayon, and can they draw shapes and things like that. But for older students, they not only work on things like helping kids with their handwriting and helping them learn typing if that's a more feasible thing for them to do, but they can also help with what's called sensory integration. There are many kiddos, especially kids with ADHD and autism, that have trouble functioning in their environment because they might be oversensitive to sound, smell, touch, all sorts of things, and it makes them either hypersensitive to their environment or undersensitive to their environment. Undersensitive might be something where they're just not alerted to the things going on around them, and they might have a hard time staying alert, or it can be so significant that they really have a high pain tolerance and aren't able to be aware that they're in pain and might have a significant injury. Oversensitive would be our kids that are oversensitive to things like noise, and so they either get scared by very loud noises, or even things like they can hear the air conditioner going on in the room and they find it distracting and they can't focus on other things. When an OT helps a child with sensory regulation issues, number one, they help them recognize what's going on in their body and what they're over and under sensitive to, and then they help them determine the best way to deal with it. And for some kids, particularly those on autism, it might be participating in some physical activities to either calm down or re-alert their system. Typical students these days actually do a lot of sensory work. It's just not necessarily called that quite so openly. If you have a typical kid in a typical classroom and they talk about doing brain gym where they have to jump and down and do some jumping jacks, or maybe get together and do a little dance number following a video on the screen before they take a spelling test or a math test, that whole sensory integration area is where that comes from. So even though in my line of work a lot of it is for kids with disabilities, a lot of more of it is getting incorporated into the typical classroom as well. So that is something that occupational therapists do. While speech, OT, and PT are, if you will, the big three that can be covered under IEPs, that's not the only types of services that are covered. Kids with visual impairments can receive orientation and mobility services, which teach them safe ways to navigate around the school building and around their immediate community. And they can also receive vision services, which may include things like teaching them Braille as appropriate, or if they have vision but still need modifications, those services can include teaching them how to use magnification software on a Chromebook and all that sort of thing. So that goes along sort of in the vision services support area, which is generally provided by an intervention specialist that specializes in the needs of kids with vision impairments. Similarly, for kids with hearing impairments, and that can be anything from auditory processing issues to partial hearing loss to fluctuating hearing loss to what they call profound hearing loss. So hearing support services can include instruction in sign language or instruction in total communication, which is a mixture of learning how to interpret speech and also understanding sign language. Hearing impaired services can also include provision of an adjustment of audiological devices. So if a kiddo needs hearing aids or an amplification system to be able to function in school, those are related services that are provided to kids with hearing impairments. And for our kids who are deafblind, which is a small but significant population out there. Many of you have only ever heard of Helen Keller 150 years ago, but there are still deafblind kids, and many of them in this day and age with technology can be more independent than ever before, but they do require support in school. So our deafblind kids usually access both vision services and hearing support services. Some of the more obscure things that you don't see quite as often on an IEP would be things like music therapy and art therapy. They don't really get into that in the federal law, but there's nothing that precludes those services, and they are becoming more and more recognized. So again, depending on each child's needs, because IEPs are individualized, an IEP can include academic goals and it may include a range of related services. And every IEP to some extent is probably going to include some accommodations to allow the child to function ideally within the typical classroom setting as much as possible. But even if they have to be in a smaller setting, accommodations can be provided in any setting across the school building, so that they are able to participate as effectively as possible. Children with disabilities can also have what are called behavioral support goals and social goals, and what those are goals that help our children with emotional issues and social issues that struggle with maintaining the right expectations of behavior. Behavioral goals will do things like provide direct modeling to children on how to handle particular scenarios and things like that. So those can be a key portion of an IEP as well. Leading from behavioral goals, that takes me over into the area of discipline, which is not directly covered in an IEP, but it is a key portion of IDEA. There are many people out there, unfortunately, who believe the myth that students on IEPs either cannot be disciplined at all, or should not be disciplined at all, or should be disciplined more, and if they are not, they are running roughshod, and the behaviors are taking away from the experience of other typical students. Unfortunately, that latter view has more problems than we as advocates would like to think. Many of you may remember Jeff Sessions, who was Attorney General very briefly in the last Trump administration and was a senator from Alabama for years and years and years. I'm not saying he was completely a horrible guy, but his attitude toward people with disabilities was very disheartening, and I know this specifically because when he was a senator, I looked up his webpage, and he had a page specifically devoted to what was wrong with IDEA and how it was unfair to teachers and students, and basically said that all children with emotional disturbances needed to be educated away from typical classrooms because they were taking away from the vital educational experiences of other kids. This was, to my mind, a very unfortunate point of view. And thankfully, we don't run across it too often, but I can say as an advocate that works with some sort of discipline issue, at minimum probably on a bi-weekly basis, sometimes more often, I think there is still some frustration out there, especially among general education teachers, that they don't know how to deal with behavioral issues, and that those kids need to be removed and in a smaller setting where somebody, quote unquote, air quotes, knows how to deal with them so that other kids can get an education. I do understand where that perspective is coming from, and there are many kids, usually those with significant mental health issues, that can sometimes deal better with a smaller setting because it's less overwhelming. But we need to remember as advocates, number one, kids with emotional issues have exactly the same civil rights as everybody else, so we cannot entirely deny an education. Furthermore, if they have emotional and social challenges, the best place to learn how to modulate their behavior is by modeling typical peers. So if we leave all the kids with emotional and social issues all in with each other all the time, they might be causing less problems in the typical classroom, but how much are they able to learn those skills? And that brings us back to, again, one of the key goals of IDEA is to make sure that when kids leave school, they are prepared to function productively in our community. It's very important to remember that even kids with social and emotional issues need to be integrated as much as possible, and that is what the law requires. As an advocate, I can say many times that I've heard principals say to myself and parents of kids with behavioral issues, well, you're only focused on this one child, and we have to worry about the safety of 500 or the safety of 1,000. And I will be the first to say, and I know of absolutely no parent that I have worked with that does not have the same priority. We care about the safety of all children, particularly in this day and age with school shootings and things like that. Emotion is absolutely nothing to take lightly. But we as advocates and parents also realize that schools have a right and a responsibility to take an active role in emotionally supporting all children, those on IEPs and those who are not, so that everybody feels safe in a typical school environment. Another key portion of an IEP would be the transition plan. As I've alluded to in the course of this video, it is a top priority for IDEA especially since the law was last revised in 2004 to make sure that kids with disabilities, regardless of the disability, come out of school prepared to do something else. And as I say that the law, here's where I'm going to have a brief editorial moment and explain that while I think transition plans are wonderful, this is an area of the law that I really think could be beefed up a bit. Because whereas all other goals in the IEP need to be worked on pretty much on a daily basis, transitional goals, you can get away with saying you're going to address something once a year or once a quarter. Like, so if one of the goals is to teach the child with a disability how to look for a job, it might say on the IEP that they need to practice that once a year. If they're interested in going to college, it might say, we'll attend the college fair in October. Now, all of that's great, but if we're really talking seriously about preparing kids with disabilities, we need to be preparing them all the time. And I'm not saying that there aren't good guidance counselors out there and intervention specialists that are working on this much more often than the minimum, but I think in many ways we kid ourselves that by writing this transition plan we have solved all the problems, because I know kids who have had great IEPs and great transition plans in high school and find themselves a bit aimless. Alright, so that covers IDEA. I'm just going to really briefly touch on how funding for it works and how that relates to the Department of Education. That gets pretty esoteric, and I don't even quite get it all, so I'm not going to bore you to death. But basically, the U.S. Department of Education, as of the 2020, allocated $15 billion for direct special education services to students with disabilities, and that particular funding goes from the federal government to the states. It is based on, and you're all going to laugh and kind of cringe, but it kind of goes to the point of the Department of Education really overspending, and I would argue that on special education they are not, because the allocation that every state is guaranteed is the equal of the allocation that in 1999. For anybody doing the math out there, that was 26 years ago. Now, mind you, that's not the only allocation they are eligible to receive. Other allocations are based on the number of students in special ed in the entire state and on the level of performance of special ed programs at the local level. And this is where we get into the oversight issue of IDEA that the federal government does, in addition to overseeing civil rights implementation. It is the job of the federal government, at least as it currently stands, to evaluate state performance on how well they are doing implementing and enforcing IDEA. So each state has to report children in special ed are meeting reading and math goals commensurate with their typical peers. They also track our students with disabilities being disciplined a disproportionate amount of time versus the population that they make up within the state and within a given school district, and all sorts of things like that. It's the way that the federal government ensures that the law is being implemented properly and the funds being used are implemented properly. So when you may hear, well, we'll just take that $15 billion and send it to the states, and that'll be great. The problem with it is that not all states necessarily implement programs the same way, because, as I said before, they do have some leeway, and not all states have equal state funding systems to federal dollars. So the problem, if you don't have federal oversight, is much like our abortion laws these days. What services you get could very well depend on the state you live in, and that puts a on families with children with disabilities, because having a disability is expensive as it is, and families can't necessarily afford to pick and choose amongst those states that might be able to serve their children better than others. In saying that, I have to acknowledge that the level of services now, and so it's not like this would be a completely new problem. But if we take away federal oversight, then it's just going to be a problem that's more magnified. Really should all want for all people with disabilities is that no matter where you live, you're guaranteed an equitable level of service to make you as educated and productive a person as you can possibly be. Interestingly, you might have noticed, those of you who are already familiar with IDEA, that I've gotten all the way through this video and never once have I mentioned the FAPE. FAPE is Free Appropriate Public Education. Actually, I take it back. I think I mentioned it once for 2 seconds. But FAPE is Free Appropriate Public Education, which is what is guaranteed to every student with a disability by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and also by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Appropriate means appropriate. It does not mean the best. And appropriate is defined by the federal government as such services that will allow you to make reasonable progress within the curriculum. In the lawyer and advocate world, you will hear this described over and over as the law guarantees you a nice functional Chevy, but not a Cadillac. In fact, it's only in recent years that Supreme Court decisions have recognized that while there is there's not a particular ceiling for support and special education services, the Supreme Court has at least recognized that there needs to be a minimal floor which a district cannot go below. As in, they cannot just, for years and years and years, particularly with our lowest functioning students, say, well, they really can't do anything, so what do you want us to do? The Supreme Court interpretation now makes clear that even for our lowest functioning students, they need to be getting a plan that is not only reasonably calculated to make progress, but they need to be showing that progress. Even if there's something called the extended standards, which take the curriculum set forth for typical students in a particular state and modifies it for people with disabilities. Even if they're at the farthest out end of the extended standards, they still have to be making some sort of progress. So there is no requirement that your child with a disability have to be able to catch up to typical peers. So that's the unfortunate part about there's no ceiling. But the Supreme Court has specified that there is a floor. I hope that this is a good overview of IDEA overall. I know I hit a lot of complex topics fairly fast, but I hope you found it helpful. And if you do have other topics you'd like me to cover in more depth, just let me know and I would be happy to. And Secretary McMahon, if you're out there and somebody shows you this, I hope you find it helpful. because you're going to have to manage the department and do something for kids with disabilities, because the Congress has not told you or the president of education can be shut down. And even those of us as advocates who can agree with you that there might be places where the Department of Education can improve buzzwords of waste, fraud, and efficiency, that doesn't mean we think it should go away, and we're not going to let it go away. I hope everybody enjoyed this video, and as I said, I will be trying to do one every few days or so as updates come through the news, and hopefully we'll get more info and clarity on what is happening for people with disabilities. As always, if any of you out there need individual services, we would love to help you, and you can reach Compass Rose at 496885922 or check us out at compassroseadvocates.com. Thank you and have a wonderful day.